wanted to thank everyone for joining us on day one of Cherry Bekaert's 2021 Virtual Real Estate and Construction Conference. My name is Mark Cooter. I'm a tax partner with Cherry Bekaert and also the leader of our real estate and construction industry group for the firm. Today, we are kicking off day one of our 2021 virtual conference. Over the next 4 days, we will be featuring 4 different presentations on a variety of hot topics, recent developments, and proposed update tailored to the real estate and construction industry. We're excited about the lineup we have planned for you this week, and we'll be offering up to 1 hour of CPE per session for those attending who need it. We hope you're able to join all 4. Here's some quick housekeeping before we get started. To receive CPE credit, you must answer at least 3 polling questions and attend for the full 50 minutes. CPE certificates will be issued via email within 10 days. If after 10 days you've not received, please email cbhlearning@cbh.com. We will have a short survey at the conclusion of the webinar, just so that we can get some feedback from you about how the webinar went. And a recorded version of the webinar will be available in about a week and will be sent via email and posted to our website. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the Q&A window located on your control panel, and we will get to those during our Q&A session. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Greg Swinson, who's going to introduce our speaker, and we're going to get started.
Hey, thanks, Mark. We have a very distinguished guest with us here this morning, Dr. Anirban Basu. He is the chairman and CEO of the SAGE Policy Group, an economic and policy consulting firm based in Baltimore, Maryland. His firm provides strategic and analytical services to energy suppliers, law firms, medical systems, government agencies, and real estate developers. In 2014, Maryland Governor Larry Hogan appointed him to be the chair of the Maryland Economic and Development Commission. Anirban also serves as a chief economist for the Associated Builders and Construction Contractors Organization and is the chief economic advisor to the Construction Financial Management Association. In 2007 and again in 2016, Dr. Basu was elected by the Daily Record newspaper as one of Maryland's 50 most influential people. And in 2010, the Baltimore Business Journal named him one of the region's 20 most powerful business leaders. He holds 4 postgraduate degrees, including a law degree and a PhD. Dr. Basu is a speaker in very high demand. We're fortunate to have him here this morning. I see that he is scheduled for upcoming NAIOP events in December and will also be a speaker at the AICPA's National Real Estate and Construction Conference. So without further delay, Dr. Basu, I will let you get started and carry the rest of the program.
Righto, Greg, thank you so much. My name is Anirban Basu. Thank you for those kind introductory remarks. And we're going to talk about the economy now. 2 goals, of course, here. One, to get you CE credits, if that's what you're looking for, but also to provide some information regarding where we're likely to be headed economically and what that means for real estate and construction as we head into 2022. My presentation is entitled Anirban Basu and the Chamber of Data. This is a Harry Potter themed presentation, and you'll see that theming throughout this presentation, whether you like it or not. Hope you don't hate it, but it is firmly baked within the cake. Now, let's begin. I mean, one thing is obvious. It is still the case that the single most influential factor shaping economic outcomes globally and now in the US is COVID-19. And this has been a shared global pandemic. And you might remember that during the early stages of this public health crisis, that there was a notion among some people, not necessarily in this audience, but among some out there, that this would last maybe 2 or 3 weeks. Yeah, we'll shut down the economy for 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks at the outside, and then Dr. Fauci will give us a thumbs up and we'll go back to it. But now we have been in this for the better part of 2 years. We spent a lot of time at home. And that's enough time, 2 years, to shift behavior. And anything that alters behavior, of course, has economic implications. And anything with economic implications has implications for real estate and construction. So we'll want to talk about that. We've been prisoners of our homes in many cases, and we might become that again. We'll see what Omicron has to say the news this morning has not been that great epidemiologically, but we'll talk more about that in as we go through the presentation. Now, you'll see also there's a Q&A box. If you want to, please enter what questions you'd like to ask, and I'll try to answer them in the so-called run of play. But let's start with the first audience poll. Go ahead. How has the economy performed over the past year in the context of the pandemic? There are 4 such questions. There's the poll. You'll be given 1 minute to answer this question, and then a very lovely voice will come on in a moment to talk about your conclusions regarding how the economy has performed. So 4 poll questions this morning. This is the first one. So let's see what you have to say about how has the economy performed over the past year in the context of the pandemic. There is no wrong answer. It's simply your answer. So let's give you a bit more time to answer. I think you'll have about half a minute left, and then we'll hear, as I say, a very excellent voice going through the results here. I can try to fill in time if you'd like. The S&P is down 18 points right now at 4637.01. The NASDAQ is up 16.30, and Omicron probably has something to do with that. The notion is that whatever Omicron brings in our direction from a public health perspective, technology will win. So let's go with the results. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. So we are going to go ahead and end the poll right now and share those results. Looks like it is a fairly even split between the first and second response, much better than expected or a bit better than expected. We had at 41%. 18% of people said it was about what they expected, 7% at a bit worse. So we're going to stop sharing and go ahead and turn it back to you, Dr. Basu.
Righto, so let's keep going here and let's talk about gross domestic product and where we have been so far. So I want to begin with some historic data here, talk about where we have been, and then at some point you'll see that I'm going to switch to a more forward-looking kind of presentation to try to give you some sense of what I think might happen in 2022. Your guess is as good as mine, but the point is CE credits, obviously. I'll try to be as accurate as possible with respect to the forecast, but who knows. But gross domestic product, 2 colors of bars here. Blue colored bars indexed to the left-hand vertical axis, red colored bars to the right. Reading from left to right, the last blue colored bar here is the 4th quarter of 2019, the last pre-pandemic quarter in America. You'll remember that we marched into 2020 with lots of economic momentum. This nation added jobs in January of 2020, added 289,000 jobs in February of 2020, shut down the economy in March. The first red colored bar, in fact, is the quarter that embodies March, that first quarter of 2020. Again, reading from left to right, the first red colored bar is the first quarter of 2020. That quarter, the U.S. economy shrinks 5% on an annualized basis. That was big news by itself. I'll give you an example here. During the 4th quarter of 2008, the worst quarter of our economic lives prior to this, the U.S. economy shrank 8.4% on an annualized basis. So a negative 5% print is a big deal. Unfortunately, this time around, it was merely the appetizer. For during the 2nd quarter of 2020, the U.S. economy shrinks 31.4% on an annualized basis. And around that time, a feverish debate breaks out in the economics community about what the initial phase of recovery might look like. Would it be U-shaped, L-shaped, Nike swoosh, square root, check mark, hockey stick? It was a straight up V. For during the 3rd quarter of 2020, the U.S. economy bounces back, growing 33.4% on an annualized basis. By the way, that's why I had to bifurcate the vertical axis, because if I try to graph these numbers of magnitude on a single unified vertical axis, a lot of these other vertical bars would simply disappear from view. We start losing momentum by the 4th quarter of last year, but for reasons we'll get into. Stimulus injected by the Trump administration on December 27th of last year, then again by the Biden administration on March 11th of this year. So during the first half of the year, supercharged by all that stimulus, the U.S. economy grows more than 6%, but then it slows markedly during the 3rd quarter, down to around 2%, 2 to 2.1% growth during that 3rd quarter. And we'll talk about other aspects of that 3rd quarter, but let's talk about one right now, inflation. So not only did the U.S. economy slow dramatically during that 3rd quarter that ended on September 30th, but also a whiff of stagflation. Inflation running at a 6.2% pace, at least consumer price inflation, between October of last year and October of this. And so we'll talk more about this as we go through that. But the 3rd quarter will not go down as a great quarter in American economic history. Now, that notwithstanding, it is still the case that along this dimension, America is more than fully recovered. By the second quarter of this year, GDP was 0.8% above its pre-recession tally, but along many other dimensions, we have not fully recovered. And one of those dimensions is the labor market. Let's talk about that now. Same setup here. Blue collar bar is indexed to the left-hand axis, red collar bar is to the right. But instead of quarterly gross domestic product, now this is monthly job change in America. We will get a jobs report 3 days hence, Friday of this week for November. So again, reading from left to right, the last blue collar bar here is February of 2020, a month during which we had 289,000 jobs, again, indexed to the left-hand axis, shut down the economy in March. First red colored bar here, again, those are indexed to the right-hand axis. First red colored bar is March of 2020, a month during which America loses 1.7 million jobs. And then things get even worse. You see that big negative red bar there, that's April of 2020, we lose 20.7 million jobs that month. So during the previous 113 months, ending with February of 2020, our nation added 22 million jobs. Between March and April of 2020, we lost about 22 million jobs. We came into this period with a 3.5% unemployment rate. That was a 50-year low. You'd have to go back to December of 1969 to find unemployment as low as it had been pre-pandemic. And just to give you a sense of how long ago that was, the Orioles were good back then. I'm from Baltimore. I know such things. No one even remembers it. Of course, we'll talk about unemployment in just a second. And around that time, the Wall Street Journal conducts a survey. Now, this is in April of 2020. The Wall Street Journal conducts a survey of economists asking them, what do they expect for May? And those economists, most economists for large US financial institutions, like small business operators like myself, they say that we're going to lose another 8 million jobs in May of 2020. But they were off, because we did not lose 8 million jobs in May of 2020. We added 2.8 million of them, followed by 4.8 million jobs added in June, and 1.7 million in July, and 1.6 million in August of 2020, and 716,000 jobs in September, and 680,000 jobs in October. Fabulous, that V-shaped recovery. I guess the reason we'll get into, by the fourth quarter, we're slowing economically. And by December, if you look carefully at those red colored bars, you see that slight sliver, negative sliver, that's December, a month during which we lose 306,000 jobs. Stimulus, December, stimulus, March of this year, we've been adding jobs ever since. But by the time you get to August and September, job growth is slowing again, particularly September. And it's not about job openings, as you know. According to the most recent data, we have 10.4 million available unfilled jobs in America. The issue has been labor supply, people unwilling to fill available job openings in meaningful numbers, except that in October, we bounced back, adding 531,000 jobs. Why did job growth pick up in October? My thesis or hypothesis, inflation. That all of a sudden, with gas prices, food prices, and other prices rising, rents, for instance, rising, more people have decided they need to work to make a living. And some people might be saying out there, you mean I have to work to make a living? That's not the America I grew up in. Actually, it is the America you grew up in. It's just that the last 18 months or 20 months have been different for many of us. In any case, these inflationary pressures probably will start to abate, and Omicron is part of that story. Oil prices, of course, have fallen quite dramatically since the World Health Organization deemed this to be a variant of concern, and we continue to get pretty negative information in terms of its spreadability and also information with respect to vaccine evasiveness. Now, along this dimension, as I say, we've not fully recovered. If you compare February of 2020 national employment to October of 2021, why these goalposts? February of 2020, the last pre-pandemic crisis month for the economy in America. October of 2021, the last month for which we have data, we're down 4.2 million jobs. This is what it says on the caption at the bottom there. Now, you can see that almost every major sector of the economy has lost jobs. Leading the pack is leisure and hospitality. 1.4 million jobs lost over the course of the pandemic. That's your restaurant and hotel jobs for the most part. Construction down 150,000 jobs. So ostensibly, there should be lots of construction workers out there to hire. And in fact, there are over 300,000 job openings for construction workers in this country that remain unfilled. So why is it so difficult to fill the bulk of these jobs? Because during the early stages of the pandemic, many baby boomers retired earlier than they had anticipated retiring and earlier than their employers had anticipated retiring. And many of those folks are best construction workers. These are folks who went to shop class in high school. often taught by someone with humongous arms and a Rush t-shirt driving a Trans Am. And they went into construction willingly. That was what they wanted to do. So many of these are our best pipe fitters or other HVAC professionals, our best roofers and glaziers and carpenters and superintendents, so on and so forth. They have retired in large numbers. And so again, this is evidence that that labor supply issue has been a quite compelling one, a quite influential one, and we'll talk more about this as we go through the presentation. Regional data. So this employment growth for the 25 largest metropolitan areas in our country, February of 2020 through October of 2021, largely a mistitled slide. There's very little evidence of employment growth here, but there were a handful of regions that have added jobs over the course of the pandemic. And number one, Phoenix, the Phoenix, Arizona metropolitan area. The governor of Arizona is a guy named Doug Ducey. Doug Ducey, very aggressive in keeping his state's economy open during the worst of the crisis, especially with respect to neighbors like New Mexico and California. At number two, Dallas, the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, much of the news recently. Greg Abbott, again, very aggressive in keeping his state's economy open, helps explain why San Antonio is tied for number three with Tampa. The governor of Florida, of course, is Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis, very aggressive in keeping his state's economy open, cherry picking out number six, Atlanta. The governor of Georgia is Brian Kemp. Brian Kemp was the first governor in the country to reopen his economy, happened on April 20th of last year. So some governors were more focused on keeping the economy open, queuing as close to normalcy as was possible. Other governors, much more aggressive in locking down their economies, at least during the early stages of the pandemic. So at number 25, at the bottom of the second column here, New York Metro. The governor of New York, of course, now is Kathy Hochul, but for much of this period, Andrew Cuomo, he and his counterpart in New Jersey, Phil Murphy, quite aggressive in keeping the economy locked down. New York City, of course, was an early stage viral epicenter. Manhattan and other boroughs were absolutely walloped by the early stages of the pandemic. And so policymakers saw fit to do things like shut down mass transit. When you shut down mass transit, you shut down much of the New York metropolitan area economy. At number 24, San Francisco. Who's the governor of California? Why, it's the wickedly handsome Gavin Newsom, utterly gorgeous, himself could be a Hollywood actor, very aggressive in keeping that economy shut down. And of course, some of the large California markets were also early stage viral epicenters. Now, why does this matter? Because, until very recently, we were thinking we might get out of this pandemic pretty soon. The Delta variant has extended it, of course. Now here comes Omicron. But this matters because of the parable of Humpty Dumpty. Humpty Dumpty, if you'll remember, is an egg with human characteristics. One day, he's just sitting on a wall, minding his own business, just being an egg. And somebody, in an act of unwarranted violence, pushes him off the wall. He breaks. Now, all the king's horses and all the king's men come to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Now, the horses have no hands, so I'm not even sure why they're there, but even the men couldn't do it. And the point is, we broke the economy in some sense. And the challenge has been to put it back together again. And that's been very key with the labor market. It's been hard to get people to come back to work. So the labor market's functioning so beautifully coming into the pandemic, but now behavior has changed. Labor market has shrunk. Labor participation rate has also declined. And so some of these results prevail. And so regions that did not shut down as aggressively haven't had the same kind of broken egg manifestation. But in New York and San Francisco, the egg was more violently broken, harder to put back together again. Okay, unemployment. As I mentioned earlier, we came into the period with a 3.5% rate of unemployment. By April of 2020, that's a big peak you see here, we're at 14.8%. Now here I'm offering you some additional granularity. I'm showing you male unemployment in blue, female unemployment in green, overall unemployment in red. Through the previous economic downturn, the Great Recession, men suffered relatively more, and that had a lot to do with construction and real estate. So 87% of construction workers at that time were men, and that segment lost 2.3 million jobs during the period of its downturn. And manufacturing chipped in another 2 million jobs lost, another male-dominated sector. This time was different. This time was about social distancing. So it was home health, private schools, daycare centers, salons, leisure hospitality, retail trade, physicians' offices, dental offices. So a lot of female-dominated occupational categories directly implicated by social distancing mandates. And so in April of 2020, while the overall rate of unemployment is 14.8%, the rate for American women is 16.1%, the rate for American men that month, 13.6%. You can see the improvement since that time. By October, we're down to 4.6% unemployment. So if there's this notion that there's this, large number of Americans, and there probably is not this notion, but if there were this notion that there's this large number of Americans who are ready to come back to the workforce, that's not true as far as we can tell. it's going to be very difficult to fill those unfilled job openings. Unemployment is low. And if you think about commercial real estate, and I know many of you have a real estate background, this Omicron variant is going to make it more difficult to bring people back to the office. And that further changes behavior, that further accustoms people to not commuting, to working from home, to doing business by Zoom, so on and so forth. So we'll talk more about commercial real estate later on in the webinar. But again, none of this is particularly positive, and it'll be very difficult to get people back to work in many instances. Again, the issue has been the labor supply curve. This is unemployment rates for those same 25 largest metropolitan areas as of September of 2021. Now, lots of things shape these data. The economic structure of economies, for instance. So Orlando fared very poorly during the early stages of the pandemic. Tourism, visitation, people going on planes and going to Disney World eventually, wasn't happening very much. So many things shape these data, but it's probably not completely coincidental that the lowest rate of unemployment is in Brian Kemp's Atlanta, Georgia, the highest rate here in Gavin Newsom's Los Angeles, California. And notice that unemployment is already 3% or less than that in a handful of metropolitan areas. So in many cases, labor force is really very tight. And one of the things that implies is that wages are going to continue to rise. Now, you might see because of Omicron, depending on how virulent it is and how problematic it is and how many shutdowns we have, if any, that you might see wage growth slow for that period. But the labor market already is quite tight, and we've got a lot of job openings out there. And at some point, we're going to reopen this economy completely, and we're going to do it without having to wear masks all the time. So that's something to watch for. So next poll, how well do you think governments in general have responded to the crisis? Poll number 2, how well do you think governments in general have responded to the crisis? Go ahead, you have a full minute to answer this question. So go ahead. Many of you are answering. We're already up to 66%, 67, 68% participated. I don't know who's slacking out there. Get to it. Answer this question. How well do you think governments in general have responded to the crisis? Fabulous. Targeted response. Decent, or really missed the mark. You all really messed it up. That's what that answer is about. So let's, I think we have 20 seconds left. Bitcoin ETF, the Bitcoin ETF at 37.56. The NASDAQ is up 5.14 points as we're speaking right now. The 10-year Treasury yield is at 1.421%. So at this point, I'm merely stalling for time to give you that full minute to respond. Bitcoin at 58,838.59. That is your Bitcoin update for this morning. Go ahead. Let's hear the results.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to end this poll and share our results. I feel like I should be talking in a Professor McGonagall voice to fit the theme, you know? So here's how our polls came in. How well do you think the governments in general have responded to the crisis? We had 6% saying fabulous. It was a targeted response. Most people are right in the middle with decent, 56% at that. And then we do have 38%, you know, they just really missed the mark. So back to you.
Righto, and decent. A majority of you said decent. And for anyone to say government did a decent job in this country, that's incredible. I think that's, I'm in a good mood now. That's wonderful. Let's talk about government, in fact. So one things I want to do is I want to switch between talking about behavioral shifts and policy shifts during the pandemic. And so if you're familiar with the Harry Potter books and movies, you know that the government of witches and wizards is known as the Ministry of Magic, the Ministry of Magic. Now, I don't know how much magic comes out of Washington, D.C. I can tell you that lots of dollars have during the course of the pandemic. Last year, for instance, 3 major stimulus packages passed. The first one signed by Donald Trump on March 27th of last year, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, or CARES Act. This was a $2.2 to $2.3 trillion package. It includes direct payments to Americans, extended and enhanced unemployment insurance, and this is your Paycheck Protection Program. Now, the economy at this point, we're talking about March and April of 2020, is in free fall. Unemployment is surging towards 15%. We're losing millions of jobs. And so less than a month later, more stimulus is injected into the economy, nearly $500 billion, in particular monies for paycheck protection and also monies to shore up healthcare delivery capacity. But then for many months after April of 2020, no new major stimulus is injected into the US economy. By the summer of 2020, the US economy is coming back strong, that V-shaped recovery. We're adding millions of jobs, unemployment is falling, stock market is booming, as is the housing market. But stimulus is a stimulant. It's not permanent. And so it works its way through the economy through the third quarter and then starts to wane in terms of impact by the fourth quarter. By October, retail sales are choppy. And as I mentioned a moment ago, by December, we're losing jobs. So suddenly the economy was falling apart once again, and with the presidential and congressional elections now behind them, Congress passes and the president eventually signs a few days later the Consolidated Appropriations Act. And in fact, he signs it 9 months precisely to the day after he signs the CARES Act, a $960 billion package, more direct payments to Americans, more extended and enhanced unemployment benefits, more loans and grants for businesses. Now, this news was trumped by a subsequent stimulus package signed by Joe Biden on March 11th, the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, a $1.9 trillion package, more direct payments to Americans, which might help explain, by the way, why some Americans have not felt the need to come into the labor force right away, because there was such stimulus payments. I'm not saying that's good policy or bad policy, that's for you to decide, but it might be one of the factors at work here, in addition to all that unemployment insurance. And this package also included direct aid to state and local governments to the tune of $350 billion. Now that's important, because a lot of this money is yet to be spent. And for many state and local governments, it's a windfall, because state revenues and local government revenues did not decline as many people had anticipated early during the pandemic. Income tax revenues held up pretty well because a lot of high income earners held on to their employment. A lot of the jobs lost were among entry level and near entry level workers in retail, restaurants, hotels, so on and so forth. It gives me no joy to say that, but these folks often don't pay a lot in income tax. Property tax collections held up pretty well. In fact, property values actually rose in many instances. And in many cases, there's a multi-year assessment cycle in any case. So there's a lag between what's happened with property values and actual property tax collections. And then corporate profits were very strong during the period. And then we bought a lot of stuff, which I'll talk about in a moment. So we couldn't consume as much in services, so couldn't take vacations, couldn't go to a ballpark or theater. And so we ended up buying a lot of material goods, and those are often subject to retail sales taxes. Now, we just passed another package, an infrastructure package. I wouldn't call it a stimulus package, but $550 billion in new infrastructure spending. And so we'll talk about the effects of that on public construction in just a moment. We'll briefly discuss that. Now, with all that spending, you could ask the question, are we being Dumbledore? Albus Dumbledore, of course, the headmaster of Hogwarts School, the school made famous by the Harry Potter books and movies, that school for witches and wizards. Are we being silly? We came into this crisis with a $23.5 trillion national debt. We're now screaming towards $29 trillion. And I was taught in economics, there is no free lunch. There is no free lunch. So at some point, we have to pay this back. If not literally pay it back, then we're going to pay for it in some other form. Bond market crisis, full-blown financial crisis, much higher interest rates, less spending on education, infrastructure, defense, and homeland security going forward. We're going to pay for this. And if you're in real estate and construction, if you're doing a SWOT analysis, then this is at the top, I think, of my threats column from a long-term perspective. Omicron might be at the top of the threat column in the short term, this new variant, but in the longer term, it's this, and what it means for the US financial system and the performance of the US economy over the long term. Let's go back now to behavior. And let's talk, really start moving more aggressively into a discussion of commercial real estate. Now, one of the things that we did earlier during the pandemic is, of course, that we shut down malls. We didn't want people to congregate, including in malls, and so and other retail centers. And so no surprise, many retailers suffered during that period. Indeed, last year was associated with plentiful or a plethora of retail bankruptcies. Here's a list of some of the large retail bankruptcies sustained in 2020. So if you look at the bottom of the third column here, you'll see that Pier 1 Imports goes bankrupt in February and closes all of its stores, though you can still buy the merchandise online. True Religion goes bankrupt in April. They're the makers of those excellent jeans that make everyone look slender. And then J. Crew, Neiman Marcus, JCPenney go bankrupt in May sequentially. GNC goes bankrupt in June. And of course, in many instances, bankruptcy is accompanied by store closure. So there's this glut of retail space out there, underutilized retail space out there, in part because of these bankruptcies. Some companies that did not go bankrupt, like a Macy's, still have been closing lots of stores and therefore putting more available square footage on the market. So GNC is the supplier of those excellent supplements that many of us take to restore our vitality, to build up our strength, to build up our musculature. I pop these pills like crazy. I still have the arms of an accountant for whatever reason. Brooks Brothers goes bankrupt in July. Lauren Taylor's at Howell Department Store in August, and then Guitar Center and Francesca's late last year. Now, I can make the case, however, that last year was an exquisite year for retail. Again, unable to consume services in significant quantities and juiced with all this stimulus from the government, a lot of people bought retailed items. This is monthly retail sales. 21 years of data here, but I'll focus on the right side of the slide. Now, there is a moment of weakness. And it begins in February of 2020, February of 2020. So February of 2020 is not a shutdown month, but by that point, you and I have heard about COVID-19. And some people are beginning to withdraw from the economy, at least partially. And global travelers also start to shut down during that point. So that's when retail sales start to stumble. And then you can see, the big downturn in March and April. So that the first part of that V is March and April as we shut down the economy in earnest. But lo and behold, what do you see? By June, retail sales are above their pre-recession peak, and they have been rising almost ever since. Now, there's some sloppiness during the fourth quarter of last year. You can see a period of decline. That's the fourth quarter of last year. But then look at the October of 2021 retail sales. Fabulous. Now, some of that is driven by inflation. So people are buying more expensive items thanks to inflation. And so that's showing up in the retail sales numbers here. This is measured in dollars as opposed to units. Nonetheless, how do we reconcile all of those retail bankruptcies with this excellent performance in retail activity? Well, of course, there was a moment of weakness. Some retailers came into this period weak financially. JCPenney comes to mind. And then, of course, some retail categories fared worse than others. This is US retail sales by type of business. And these horizontal bars represent the percentage change in retail sales for that period, February of 2020, the last pre-pandemic crisis month for the economy, to October of 2021. So it wouldn't surprise anyone here that the leading category here in terms of growth is the internet. Well, of course. Of course. I mean, we spend a lot of time at home. So that's been part of the behavioral shift here. And that's one of the pressures, of course, for brick and mortar retail going forward, including from a commercial real estate perspective. So this is Jeff Bezos and Amazon. Jeff Bezos had a good year last year, not romantically, but in terms of hiring 500,000 associates, continue to hire this year, including for this ongoing holiday shopping season. Now, the second category here is a brick and mortar category. It's sporting goods, hobby, book, and music stores. What's that about? That's about the sale of Peloton bikes and other exercise equipment. If people couldn't go to the gym, they brought the gym into their residence. So they bought the Peloton perhaps, or some other bike. They bought the rowing machine, the stair stepper, that mirror thing I don't fully understand. And so one of the questions you might ask is, well, people go back to the gyms. And of course, CEOs of Planet Fitness and other gym or exercise-oriented organizations will say, of course they're coming back. But in many cases, I don't think they will. Why? Because they're only using their membership twice a year to begin with, once after Thanksgiving and once after Christmas, and now they might have more equipment in the home. Now, at the very bottom, you can see the worst performing categories. At the very bottom is food services and drinking places. Food services and drinking places. That's a fancy way of saying restaurants and bars. So most of you will call that restaurants and bars. We economists refer to this as food services and drinking places, which is one of the many reasons many of us have never been on a date. And then moving up from two categories from that, electronics and appliance stores. Now you might say, Anirban, we've been spending a lot of time at home, so I would expect that to have seen the demand for electronics and appliances would be very, very high. It has been very high. What's the issue here? The supply chain, lack of computer chips, lack of appliance inventory, lack of Sony PlayStation 5, so on and so forth. And so again, this is that supply side. Those supply side constraints manifesting themselves here on this particular slide. And with Omicron, of course, the economy shutting down, especially in Europe right now, but we'll probably see something similar to this in Asia. In fact, we've seen that in Malaysia and some other societies with Delta, but here comes this new variant. So again, these supply chain disruptions will continue into 2022. They would have anyway, but Omicron just extends this further. And then clothing accessory stores, another weak category. Well, of course, we were buying a lot of clothing during the early stages of the pandemic. We were going out. Who are we trying to impress? You basically need to look good from here on out. If you can see me here, this is the zone where you have to look good. I mean, question for you, am I wearing pants? You don't know, and I shall not be indicating one way or another. That's not one of the poll questions. Now, another sector that was really hit hard, of course, is restaurants. Let's talk about that now. And this is one of the other behavioral changes, as it turns out, because economists and other observers became less satisfied simply waiting back for the monthly or quarterly data. During the pandemic, one of the things that happened is that high-frequency data became much more popular. This is high-frequency data. It comes out every day from OpenTable. It's US restaurant reservations. And the squiggly green line here represents the percentage change in restaurant reservations on any given date vis-a-vis the same date in 2019. So look for the left of the slide here. You can see that back in March and April of 2020, we go down to negative 100%. We shut down the restaurant dining sector of the United States. I mean, people could, of course, take out and those kinds of things, but we shut down indoor and to a large extent outdoor dining for a time. Now, my staff in Baltimore created this slide for me. They're mostly in their 20s and 30s. They're millennials. And they took the vertical axis down to negative 120%. And I need to tell them, once they get back into the office, that once you can go down as negative 100%, please set that aside. That's an internal staffing issue. Now, you can see here as we get into May and June, recovery. We're getting back towards 2019 levels, but we don't get there. And we suffer repeated setbacks. Why? Well, of course, multiple viral surges. So we had the summer surge last year. After that March and April surge initially, then we had the southern summer surge, Florida, Georgia, Texas, Arizona, Southern California. Then we had the surge after Labor Day last year. That was a national surge. Then the even bigger surge earlier this year, pre-vaccination. And then more recently, the Delta variant. And now here comes Omicron. So $6 trillion in stimulus, much of it direct payments to households over the course of the pandemic. And yet we're back to 2019 levels in terms of restaurant reservations. And now here comes Omicron. And so you're going to see again a pullback in restaurant activity, unfortunately, going forward. That's, it's an awful time of the year for this to happen. Awful, I suppose, any time of the year. And here's the amazing thing about this. Even though restaurants are basically have been back to 2019 levels of reservations, you talk to any restaurateur, they'll tell you, where are the workers? I can't staff up fully. Where are they? I can't maintain regular hours. My service has been impacted. And again, that gets back to these labor supply issues. And Omicron does not help along that dimension either. Now, next audience poll. How would you characterize the housing market? Because we're going to turn to real estate and construction now. So how would you characterize the housing market? It's a price bubble, baby. Okay, I should have said baby. That was too much. I went too far there. Prices are just right, sir and madam. And then the median home remains undervalued. The median home remains undervalued. It's a price bubble. Prices are just right. The median home remains undervalued. So let's give you some time to answer this question. Again, this is for your CE credits, but also to know what you think about the market. Many of you come from a real estate background, so your answers here will be very interesting. Bitcoin up 888 points today at more than 59,000. West Texas Intermediate oil down nearly 3%. The 10-year Treasury yield still hanging in there at around 1.449%. 9 seconds left to answer this. The NASDAQ is down 15.44 points at 15,766. And there it is. So let's hear what you have to say.
All right, good deal. We are going to end this poll. It's a price bubble, baby. I'm just going to play off of what you said. We had 78% people come through with that answer. Prices are just right. We are roughly at 20%, and then 3% coming in at the median home remains undervalued.
It's not clear to me when this webinar faltered, when things fell apart. I think it started with me, as it turns out, and just keeps evolving. But in any case, let's move on and talk about real estate. So if you're familiar with the Harry Potter books and movies, you know that any student who gains admittance into Hogwarts is allocated into one of four houses. There's Hufflepuff, there's Gryffindor. Indeed, Harry Potter and his two best friends, Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger, are members of Gryffindor. It's a very active house. I'm from Baltimore, and every wizard from Baltimore ends up in Ravenclaw. That's just a rule. I'm not making this stuff up. I'm just telling you what it is. There's some other rules out there. So, for instance, if you're from Pittsburgh, you end up in Slytherin, and of course, no one from Cleveland gets in. Now, one of the aspects, of course, of policymaking has been fiscal policymaking. We've talked about that, at least to some degree. But another aspect of policymaking has been monetary policymaking. Obviously, the Federal Reserve has been very active during this period as well, striving to keep interest rates as low as possible through various mechanisms of quantitative easing and directly controlling those short-term rates and keeping them basically as low as possible. Here I'm showing you two interest rates of interest. I'm showing you the 15-year fixed mortgage rate in red and the 30-year fixed mortgage rate in blue. And you can see that despite inflation, so one of the things that economic theory would predict is when you have higher inflation, you also have higher interest rates. So far, we've not really seen that, not to any meaningful degree. Look, I don't think it would surprise any member of this esteemed audience to hear that home prices were rising prior to the pandemic. Well, of course they were. During the start of the pandemic, the inventory of unsold homes is low. We're adding tons of jobs. Wage growth is high or rapid in the context of 50-year low unemployment. And mortgage rates, you'll notice here, were quite low, based on history prior to the pandemic. I think it can be viewed as somewhat surprising that the pace of home price appreciation has expanded so dramatically during a pandemic that has cost us hundreds of thousands of lives, shrunk our employment base by 4.2 million and also shrunk our labor force. But here it is. This is the S&P Case-Shiller U.S. National Home Price Index. And this explains why many of you out there think this is a bubble baby. Now, I'm not quite sure it is. Okay, so a lot of people, if you look at this slide, would say, oh, this is 03, 04, 05 all over again. I don't think that's right. And one of the things I want to do for you as I move toward the tail end of this presentation is I want to share with you a number of leading economic indicators, because I'm trying to make the turn now from talking about historic information to try to be a bit more forward-looking, a bit more forecast-oriented. Here is a leading indicator. This is U.S. residential building permits. It's a leading indicator because if you're a builder, you've got to pull a permit before you build. Now, the segment I'm going to focus on here is the red segment. It relates to single unit structures. This is relates to the construction of your single family detached homes and your townhomes. Now, look back in 03, 04, 05, how much we were building. And note also that we artificially stimulated demand during that period through faulty lending. So whether it was no document loans or subprime mortgages or whatever form it took, and then we supplied to that artificially induced demand. So that house of cards had to tumble, and it did. But then for many, many years, we haven't built many single family homes. Any neighborhood you look at out there, the inventory of unsold homes is very low. There was a bit of a surge after the early stage of the pandemic in single family building permits. You can see that here, that V-shaped recovery, but nothing like what we saw in 02, 03, 04, 05. And so when I look at supply demand equilibrium, I don't see a bubble here necessarily. Now, at some point, could home prices fall? Yes. But I don't think that's necessarily evidence of a speculative bubble. I think that's more because mortgage rates at some point are going to rise. And that truncates the buying power of buyers, and therefore that could cause home prices to fall. That's true. But from a supply-demand perspective, we're not oversupplied in this country with respect to owner-occupied housing. In fact, if anything, we're undersupplied. So in any case. Now, one of the other things that's happened here, and one of the reasons demand has been so strong for home ownership opportunities is social distancing, remote work, other phenomena that cause us to want to move further away from city centers. And there was some unrest in Minneapolis and many other cities last year, so that might be another factor. We could debate that, but this is what I'm trying to get at here: migration patterns. There's a red colored bar there that reflects the 2 million people who moved out of principal cities last year. You see the blue colored bar there that reflects the 3 million people who moved to the suburbs. Now, yes, we're seeing some reverse migration now. We're seeing some people move back to the cities. That's true. We're seeing apartment rents rise and occupancy rates rise. But I would say to you that there's been a permanent alteration in how we behave, where we live, or what choices we have in front of us. So here's what I mean. I would say to you, one of my theses is that proximity has lost some of its value. Here's what I mean by that. Ask yourself the question, why is Manhattan so expensive? Proximity. Proximity to what? Well, Wall Street is right there. The two largest central business districts in America are in Manhattan. That's Lower Manhattan, the Financial District, and Midtown. Broadway, Central Park, views of New Jersey, also Brooklyn. It's very glamorous. But in a world of remote work, online shopping, and streaming of Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, Apple TV, Paramount Plus, and HBO Max, maybe proximity doesn't have quite as much value. You can see that to a certain extent in apartment rents, at least early during the pandemic. This reflects apartment rent changes between March and December of last year. If you look for the left-hand portion of the slide, in San Francisco, rents fell 27%. Seattle, 22% during that 9-month period. Boston, 21%. New York, 20%. Washington, San Jose, 15%. Proximity lost some value. Now, some of this is temporary. Some of this is because people moved out of central cities during the early stages of the pandemic. They moved in, with family, parents in particular, and that caused occupancy rates to fall and rents to fall. So some of this is bouncing back. I understand that. And it's bouncing back in part because home prices are so high that many young families who would aspire to purchase a home can't find one, so they end up leasing for another year or two, and that drives up occupancy and rents. But you'll notice that rents did not decline everywhere during the crisis. Not in Fresno, not in Tucson. And I think one of the things that's happening here is remote work is creating more choices for people about where they want to live. The magic might be for a household, look, I want an employer in Manhattan or Silicon Valley or Boston or some other very expensive place, but I want to live in Reading, Pennsylvania or Bakersfield, California. And I'll arbitrage. My cost of living will be lower. My pay will be just as high as it would be if I was working as I used to in person. So there's some serious centrifugal forces pushing people out of city centers. And I think that the story this decade will be about the suburbs. The previous segment was about the cities. It was about millennials, our most educated, largest generation, moving to cities in large numbers, and not just those red hot southern cities like Nashville, Austin, Charlotte, Atlanta. That was part of the story, but Boston, New York, San Francisco, Seattle, so on and so forth. This decade, I think, will be a bit different. You can see that in this way as well. You see that purple line, that dark purple line at the bottom? That reflects the rent decline sustained in principal cities last year. You see the light purple line? That's what happened in suburban cities. So I'm from Baltimore. Suburban cities are the likes of Ellicott City, Columbia, Towson, Hunt Valley, White Marsh, Owings Mill, so on and so forth, Fallston, Bel Air. That's where the rents are declining because that's where the population is moving from. And I would say that in terms of multifamily has held up much better than I would have expected, that much of the strength in multifamily going forward will be in the suburbs as opposed to the cities. So the inverse of what we observed during the previous decade. Next question. How long do you think it will take the commercial construction industry to stabilize? So this commercial construction to stabilize to the prior level of construction spending. It's already stabilized. Late 2021, 2022, 2023 or beyond, it may never reach pre-pandemic levels. It may never reach pre-pandemic levels. Let's see what you have in store for us. It's already stabilized. A, B, late 2021, C, 2022, D, 2023 or beyond, E, it may never reach pre-pandemic levels. The 10-year treasury at 1.456%. As I'm speaking to you, Bitcoin at 58,602.80. So if you own Bitcoin, it's up $500 today. Congratulations for doing nothing. 10 more seconds here in this poll.
And I did want to remind folks that if they have any questions, they can drop those into the Q&A box that is down at the bottom. So if you've already submitted your poll, looks like most of you have, feel free to type any questions that you might have for Dr. Basu down in that Q&A box. And it's time to end this poll. So let's see our front runners. 2023 or beyond, we had 44% come in with that. The rest, it's a pretty even mix. It's already stabilized at 13%, 9% for late 2021, 22% of you said 2022, and 13% said it may never reach pre-pandemic levels.
Right, and yes, please do use that Q&A box. So again, another leading indicator here, but this one relates more neatly to commercial construction. This is the Architecture Billings Index. You see the 50-yard line running west-east across that slide. Any reading above 50 means that architects are busier this month than they were last month. Now you can see that for the last 9 months, architects have been getting busier month by month by month. And many architects tell me, I'm as busy now as I was pre-pandemic. But here's the issue in my mind, what I would call the conversion rate. So what do I mean by that? So this is a leading indicator because the notion is that if architects are busy upstream, construction firms will be busier downstream, but the project has to first be designed. So more design work implies more construction work downstream. But we're in a situation in which projects may not move forward. So there's lots of capital out there, there's lots of liquidity, there's lots of private equity money out there. That people are looking to deploy monies to try to generate some return on that cash. So and real estate and construction happens to be one of the ways to try to generate a return. So lots of design work out there, but does that translate necessarily this time around into a lot more commercial construction? Not obvious. In fact, if you look at the coincidental indicator, non-residential construction put in place, you see the dark blue segment at the bottom there? That's private construction. There's no recovery there in private non-residential construction. You see the light blue segment there? That's public construction. So that's about to take off thanks to the infrastructure package. You see a lot of growth in the public construction, of course. It could be schools, roads and bridges. You're going to see a lot, water systems, so on. But it's the private segments I'm focused on right now. Now, as defined by the U.S. Census Bureau, there are 16 categories of non-residential construction in our country. All are reflected here. And these horizontal bars represent the percentage change in non-residential construction spending for the 5-year period spanning from February 2015 to February of 2020. Now, the top category here in terms of performance is public safety. Set that aside. That relates to our pandemic response, turning convention centers into temporary hospitals, that kind of thing. So set that aside. Second category here is office. And what I'm trying to say here is that during the 5 years preceding this pandemic, we built a ton of office buildings in this country. And now we know that many Americans are as productive or more productive working from home. But here's what really matters. Who cares about productivity? Employers, disproportionately. What do employees care about? Quality of life. What do millennials care about? Work-life balance. That's code for not much work, lots of life. And so again, and Omicron, of course, adds to the misery here because it makes it that much more difficult for people to come back to the office. Lodging, that's number 3 here. What's that? That's new hotel room construction. We built a ton of new hotel rooms just before this pandemic. And now we've become accustomed to doing business by Zoom. No longer a golf course necessarily or a smoke-filled room. Now it's Zoom. So, and no one's supposed to anymore, basically. So the point is, some of these commercial construction segments are set up to be quite weak. And so I would tend to agree with those folks who said 2023 or beyond. It's going to take quite some time for some of these segments to recover. And part of that's because of how much we constructed prior to the pandemic, and a pandemic that's changed our behavior with respect to things like work in the office or business travel. Now, the previous slide was the 5 years prior to the pandemic. This is pandemic. February of 2020 to September of 2021. Look what's at the bottom here, lodging. So developers can tell we don't have a lot of demand for new hotel rooms. Now, high-end resorts, the rich got richer, so high-end resorts, I think that segment will be just fine. But the hotel segment overall, or new hotel construction, that segment strikes me as remaining weak for quite some time. And then office, you see that a few categories up from that, office down 30.2%. Now that's misleading statistically because the office category also includes the construction of data centers. And data center construction, of course, is fast and furious, along with fulfillment centers, backbones, for instance, of the e-commerce economy. But traditional office-based construction is down. So, we see many prominent firms, some of the technology firms, for instance, saying, look, you want to work from home, you can work from home indefinitely. That does not imply near-term recovery in non-residential construction. Just a few slides left here. I need to probably wrap up pretty quickly here, but one of the other factors at work here, and one of the reasons that conversion rate is softer is materials prices. So many project owners are going to bid, and then they find these bids are very high because materials prices are taken off. This is the Construction Materials Producer Price Index. So these horizontal bars reflect the 12-month percentage change as of October of 2021 in terms of materials price increases. So overall, over the past 12 months, materials prices are up 21.1%, but natural gas up 231.3%, so on and so forth. So, and of course, labor has become more expensive as well. And so you put all this together, and there's a lot of reason to believe that, yes, architects are busy. They're designing lots of projects, but not a lot of this is going to necessarily be converted into actual construction because of some of these hurdles. Last audience poll. What is the risk of elevated inflation over the next 2 years? Please select the response that is closest to your expectation. And remember, this is in the context of transitory, right? Inflation was supposed to be transitory, supposed to be very temporary. Supply chains were supposed to come back to life globally, and supply was supposed to rise up to meet demand. And we are still in this period of pretty significant inflation. And now here comes Omicron, adding further supply chain interruption. So A, 100%, B, more likely than not, C, small to zero probability. Forecast. Let me do some crystal balling for you. Now, economists have a tendency to excessively complicate matters. We've seen that during this last 50 minutes or so. And we do this on purpose, as it turns out. And the notion is that if you don't understand what we're saying, you'll deem us to be highly intelligent. So you might say to the host here, oh, thank gosh, thank goodness you invited Basu. So, fantastic. Didn't understand a bloody thing he said, but very intelligent. But as it turns out, economics is pretty simple. It comes down to two things, demand and supply. And in America, the principal source of demand is the consumer. So this comes from the University of Michigan. This is their index of consumer sentiment. So this is a measure, another leading indicator. It measures their psychology. Now, Michigan being Ohio State, so they're very proud of that. But look at the index here. Consumers are in the dumps psychologically. There's not much happiness in America. That's why I was so impressed by your answer, decent performance by government. So because there's so much unhappiness in America, so the notion that anything could be decent, really quite astonishing. In any case, leading indicator, except it's not a particularly good one, because I can make the argument that the American consumer has never been in better shape financially. Now, obviously, there are many families struggling out there with student debt and eviction possibilities and so on and so forth, food insecurity. But many Americans took the opportunity of this pandemic to improve their household balance sheet and to rack up a lot of savings. This is the U.S. savings rate. Savings is a percentage of personal disposable income. I won't go through this slide at length, but what I will say is that during the pandemic, American households cumulatively saved about $3 trillion in excess of what they would have saved but for the pandemic. And they were saving actually a fair amount before the pandemic. Before the pandemic, the savings rate was between 7 and 8%. The big peak here is April of 2020, 33.7%, because money was coming to the household, including stimulus payments, but was not easily spent as a lot of the economy was shut down. But notice in September, the savings rate falls. And there's evidence that more Americans are having to dip into savings to finance their lifestyles, which helps explain, by the way, why in October we added 531,000 jobs, because more Americans are saying, I got to go back to work. That's actually one of the benefits of inflation, as it turns out. But again, the consumer side of the economy, the demand side of the economy is pretty strong. And business investment is up too, by the way. Why? They can't find workers. So they're investing more in equipment, productivity enhancing equipment. So the demand side of the economy is strong. And then you lay on top of that government spending, including federal demand, including for infrastructure. What's the issue here? Supply side. Supply chain disruptions. We can talk about this all day. The port of Los Angeles, port of Savannah, Malaysia, and so on and so forth. Lack of semiconductor chips from Taiwan and other parts of the world. Yes. Here I'm going to show you the lack of small business confidence. This comes from the National Federation of Independent Business. Small businesses are not confident in America. And why is that an issue? Because if they're not confident, only 10% in October said it's a good time to expand their business over the next 3 months. They can't find workers. They're facing inflation. So the problem here is what? If they're not confident, they will not invest in capacity so supply can rise up to meet demand. So despite that, all these issues, until recently, the forecast for 2022 has been quite upbeat from many sources. This is from the International Monetary Fund, which until recently has been predicting that the global economy will spend 4.9% next year, and the US economy 5.2%. I don't think we can get there because these supply chain issues are still there. It's not just about the global supply chain. We have a shortage of 80,000 truck drivers in America. You don't cure that overnight. And then here comes the Omicron variant, which seems like it's going to have a real negative impact on the first quarter. The current quarter is good, by the way, for economic growth. The current quarter is good because it's the consumer spending quarter. It's the holiday shopping quarter, the Christmas quarter. But next year, start of next year, I think will be quite weak economically. Final slide. For an economy to flourish, both demand and supply sides of the economy must participate. Ongoing stimulus, demand gets a further boost, but supply continues to be constrained by numerous factors, not just in America. So this is obviously global, and Omicron adds to this. In fact, Chairman Powell of the Federal Reserve is talking right now about the Omicron and it adding to economic risk. That much is sure. We don't know that much about Omicron, by the way. What we do know is that it adds to economic uncertainty, and that by itself impacts the forecast. Household savings will remain elevated for the foreseeable future because some people are already going to start pulling back on expenditures, given this new form of uncertainty. The back half of 2021 should have been spectacular for economic growth. I've been forecasting that all year. The fourth quarter will be good statistically. I mean, this is going to be a good quarter, 7% growth, something like that. But then, as I say, the early stage of next year will be problematic. And then finally, there will be a day of reckoning as deficit hawks come back into fashion. We've amassed a massive national debt, no free lunch. We will pay for that. With that, let me give way. I think you got your credits.
Thank you, Dr. Basu. Really appreciate that great information. A lot there about where we kind of are, how we got here, and hopefully on what may be coming up in the future to help people plan accordingly. So that concludes our first session of our conference. Thank you for joining us. If you have additional questions regarding today's topic, please reach out to Dr. Basu directly or myself at any time. We'd be happy to answer and connect anybody that needs that. We value your feedback and ask that you take part in a short survey, which will appear when you leave the session, just to let us know how the session went for you. Our next webinar on lessons learned and best practices with our Opportunity Zone Deal panel will be tomorrow morning at 10 Eastern, and we hope you can all join us again then. Thank you.